Generative AI tools such as ChatGPT, Bard, or DALL-E have been taking the business, tech, and tech writing sphere by storm over the past months. Witness also all of the activity in the AI channel on the Write the Docs Slack. But amidst all of this buzz, people have actually been pulling in different directions. So on the one hand, we have people who say generative AI is going to revolutionize experiences, it's going to create safer digital spaces, or catalyze entire fields. On the other hand, we also have people who say generative AI, it's going to be a rat race, it amounts to a Pandora's box, it's going to be a crisis, or overall just move too fast. Now, when a phenomenon is so new and so much is unknown, then a lot of uncertainty can come creeping in. Like, am I doing the right thing? Am I going to miss the boat? Will I regret using this? Will I regret not using this? As a tech writer who's also worked in philosophy and ethics for many, many years, at least some of these questions to me sound like ethical questions. So in this talk, I'd like to focus on the coming together of these different considerations. When in tech writing and in the documentation sphere, you're using generative AI tools, what sort of ethical considerations might then arise? So that's the plan. AI ethics for tech writing. I'd say, let's go. Now, before we do anything else, let's first get our terminology cleaned up. What do I mean by generative AI and what do I mean by ethics? Now, broadly, generative artificial intelligence, or AI, refers to a human-created, non-biological system that can itself create or generate new things in response to inputs or prompts. Now, opinion, I don't particularly love the term artificial intelligence because it invites anthropomorphizing. And it easily leads to headlines such as, can a language model be conscious? Calm down, there is no conscious AI. Or, I want to be alive! Has Microsoft's AI chatbot become sentient? Now for this talk, forget all of that speculation. Because what we're dealing with in the recent AI boom is machine learning. Machine learning refers roughly to a process where a computer system is not provided with a ready-made human-developed algorithm, but instead is put in the position to discover or develop an algorithm itself through a process of lots and lots of training on huge data sets. Where for the training data, you can think of the whole of Wikipedia, the whole of GitHub, the whole of whatever is your favorite social network, entire image-based platforms, and all of that. Now, the machine learning model, so the mathematical representation that results from all of such training, can itself be huge. The model can have lots and lots of parameters, meaning weights and biases, and with lots, I mean running into the billions. The generative artificial intelligence can be understood as a subclass of such wider machine learning processes. So instead of being trained to classify data or to predict new values, generative machine learning models can, in response to an input, create new things. So new text, new code, new audio, video, or images which resemble human-generated text, code, audio, video, or images. Okay, how might generative AI be useful for technical writers? Well, how about AI-powered chat for your product documentation? Spending 10 times less on your support documentation? Automatically generated docs from your code? Your documentation never being out of date again? Or magically creating stunning FAQs, how-to guides, onboarding documents, feature notes? As a technical writer, you could work with an all-purpose general foundation model directly, or you could subject it to additional domain-specific training, or you could use one of the many, many tools built on top of these models. Okay, I hope that gives you a sense of how generative AI can be understood. How about this other core term, ethics? With ethics, it's really easy to get all bogged down with a long list of principles, rules, do's and don'ts. Now, I'm not going to go into any of that here today. Instead, for the purposes of this talk, I'll take ethics as having to do with people's actions, including the consequences and values associated with those actions. Now, I'd like to make this more concrete by looking at action from 3 different angles. So first, how an action impacts on people's cognition and knowledge, which affects ethical values such as truth, accuracy, completeness, clarity, or coherence. Second, I want to look at agency, or people's ability to act freely and effectively, which affects values such as productivity, autonomy, freedom, and creativity. And third, there is the impact on relations. So these are relations to yourself, to other people, or to organizations, communities, or even entire ecosystems. And this associates with values such as accountability, responsibility, reliability, and trust. Okay, good. That gives us generative AI. That gives us ethics. Let's now make these points more concrete for tech writing by running through various different scenarios and highlighting some of the ethical considerations for tech writing that may come up in these cases. Does that sound all right? Assuming so, let's start with a most basic scenario. A technical writer producing documentation with the use of generative AI tools. Now, this situation could occur, for example, when you give a tool your knowledge base and user queries to generate a frequently asked questions document. Or when you give a tool some code to generate documentation for. Or when you feed a tool your documentation to translate for localization. Now, how might ethical considerations come in such a situation? Well, using generative AI to create documentation could positively impact a tech writer's agency. Because with such a tool, you could produce more useful documents faster, so increase your productivity. But you could even be able to use generative AI tools as a brainstorming assistant, which may increase your creativity. At the same time, there are also risks. For one, generative AI tools for language, code, images, or anything really, are known to be imperfect, almost by definition, because they're statistical models working with probabilities. Their output must be expected at certain points to be incomplete or incoherent. It could contain plagiarized material or disrespect copyright licensing. It can contain errors, inaccuracies, inappropriate material, which can get you to quips such as, "Ha ha, ChatGPT thinks that Uhuru Kenyatta is the president of Kenya." But trickier yet, generative AI tools can be convincingly wrong, making it difficult to spot. So if you, as a tech writer, are using AI tools for generating documentation, then you are using tools with a likelihood of bringing in falsehoods or other problems. Now, bringing falsehoods or errors into your documentation is of ethical concerns because it impairs knowledge. So it could potentially lead to quite serious issues, damage or loss for the user of the documentation. Now, of course, once you are aware of this risk, it gives you space for possible remedies. Because depending on the scale at which you're operating, you could technically insert a human being and their judgment as a quality check for anything before it's being released out into the wild, and so mitigate some of the ethical issues that could arise. But there is another ethical issue that could arise when you're using generative AI tools in tech writing. And this can be called accountability displacement. There's the idea that who is doing something or who is accountable is this tool rather than you as a tech writer. And you can already subtly see this in how people talk about some of these tools as output. For example, ChatGPT thinks that blah, blah, blah. Bing says that blah, blah, blah. Or Tay has caused such and such. Now, given the human tendency to anthropomorphize, the generative AI tool is easily treated like an actor that does or chooses things, making it rather easy to hold it responsible for anything that might go wrong, rather than yourself or the developer or the organization that brought this tool out into the world. Already in 1996, the philosopher Helen Nissenbaum indicated that there is this massive tendency to treat the computer, in this case meaning the generative AI system, as a scapegoat when things go wrong, so that everybody else can avoid taking responsibility. Ethically, such accountability displacement is quite a serious point. So you can ask, can this be remedied, just like we were able to work around the generative AI's possible errors? Possibly, but it might take some work. In a follow-up paper from 2022, Nissenbaum and colleagues suggest that institutional frameworks that call some actors to account could be helpful in building a culture of accountability. So that's not really anything that you could do on your own, but which would require much broader coordination. So yeah, I'll just flag this as a point of ethical awareness when you are using generative AI tools. Now let's zoom out and swap things around a bit. So here's another scenario: a technical writer, documentation, a documentation user, and in the middle, the generative AI tool that is made available to the documentation user directly to interact with the documentation. Now this could happen, for example, when you present a user with a trained chatbot or a voice assistant to answer documentation-related questions. Now, on the face of it, this scenario is quite similar to the one that we already discussed, except that someone else is using the generative AI tool, namely the documentation user rather than the technical writer. But even that tiny swap can have quite a different ethical impact. Because allowing the documentation user to interact with a generative AI tool directly could make things more interactive, more dynamic, and it might increase the user's sense of control. And that could positively impact their agency. Though be aware, of course, that one person's dynamic is another person's chaotic. Allowing a documentation user to interact with a generative AI tool could also make the results more tailored to the user's specific needs, so be more precise and relevant. And that could in turn impact on the user's knowledge. Yet, there are also ethical risks. As with the case that we had where the tech writer operates the generative AI tool, there is with these tools the risk of errors, incompleteness, misleading answers. And of course here too, because of the human tendency to anthropomorphize, there is a risk of accountability displacement. But ethically and practically, there is a core difference. And the difference is that, with respect to the risk of errors, the main mitigation strategy that we mentioned earlier is no longer available. If a documentation user directly interacts with a chatbot or a voice assistant to use your documentation, then you can't slip in your own or your colleagues' judgment to act as a quality check or a safety control check. I mean, in theory, you could try, but it would slow everything down and it definitely wouldn't scale. As an example, this risk recently materialized when Mozilla released its AI help tool, which did in some cases provide users with incorrect or misleading answers. following which Mozilla did put this specific initiative on hold. So is there a way to remedy this risk? I'd say remedying completely might be quite tricky, but you could try some mitigation efforts. For example, you could regularly try out and check the quality of the answers that you're getting yourself, which of course doesn't rule out that there could be errors, but it can give you some indication of the quality of the output. Plus also communicate. So clarify to the documentation user what is experimental, what isn't, what are the risks that they might be running, and whether they are comfortable with taking those risks. Let's turn to a third and final scenario. So we've already done one zooming out move. I'd now like to push that still one step further. As a tech writer, you're part of a community, most likely several. Your documentation user will also most likely be part of several communities. Tech writing and technical documentation and any generative AI use are part of a wider world. But in that case, I would say it's fitting also to cast a yet wider ethical lens on using generative AI in creating, accessing, or otherwise working with documentation. Now, of the many points that I could surface here, I'll foreground two. Taking a wider perspective, you cannot escape how these generative AI systems are trained. Training huge language, image, voice, or other models generally requires huge datasets. And often, in practice, with training data that is hoovered up from the internet. And this can concern not just public domain material, such as from Wikipedia, but also posts from entire social networks, image sharing platforms, or conversations that you've had. And this happens often without people's consent, and without them being given even a chance to opt out or withdraw. And if we must go there, without compensation. Such massive scale data extraction cannot but impact ethically on relations. It may constitute a form of exploitation of people's data. And as such, it could hurt trust on the part of the wider community. For example, in recent months, there's been a bit of a backlash against providers, for example with OpenAI and Google, facing lawsuits for grabbing people's images to train their generative AI systems. Is there a possible remedy for this? There might be. The easiest and most straightforward thing to do as an individual technical writer is to be selective in which generative AI tools you use and how their models were trained. Now, very useful here in this case can be the idea of a so-called model card from a paper by Margaret Mitchell and colleagues. Now, the idea here is that for each machine learning model, including those that underpin generative AI systems, you provide a model card which states, among other things, who built it, when it was built, what algorithms, parameters, or constraints were used, its intended use, performance metrics, and both ethical considerations and the training data that was used. Although the authors do note that it may not be possible to provide this in practice. Now, consulting such a model card should help you, as a tech writer, to ask yourself, what are my options? What are my responsibilities? Am I comfortable with a tool that relies on using people's data in this way? Second, and finally, when you use generative AI tools as a tech writer nowadays, you can't really ignore issues about energy use and its impact on the climate. As I am recording this, we have just had the hottest day on record in the hottest month on record. Energy use associated with generative AI systems and its impact on the planet is significant. For example, a study showed that the CO2 emissions of training one large language model were equivalent to 150 round trips between Beijing and New York. So if you are using generative AI tools to create, update, or make available documentation, then such energy use and associated emissions are ethically significant. In terms of our professional relations as tech writers, to ourselves, to one another, wherever our colleagues might be based in the world, and of course to our documentation users, wherever they might be based in the world. And to really blow up the scale, to the planet. Now you might think that I'm being a bit dramatic here, and that's fine. And yes, I also know that there are lots of other industries that have a comparatively far larger impact. But as I see it, that is no reason to shirk our responsibility. Think of it this way. What use is there for high-quality technical documentation on a burned, boiled, and flooded planet? I realize that this is a bit of a big ethical thought to put all the way towards the end of a talk. And I'm afraid that any remedy that I might be able to give you won't take the form of, this is what you can do right now to solve all of this immediately. But it would be wise, as inhabitants of this planet, to radically, dramatically, start doubling down on clean, renewable energy and to move towards net zero. Okay, so where does this leave us? Generative AI tools are likely to have a huge continued impact on the technical writing craft and profession over the years to come. In this talk, initially we looked at generative AI in the case of a tech writer producing documentations. Then we brought in the documentation user. And then we zoomed out yet further to wider groups, society, and the planet. Across these different scenarios, we looked at the ethical dimensions of someone's ability to act or agency, relations between people and between things, and the impact on people's knowledge and cognition. Now, by no means have I covered every possible ethical advantage or issue that can and does come up when, as a tech writer, you're using generative AI tools for your work. In fact, a massive gap that I haven't discussed at all, how generative AI might differentially benefit or harm specific groups of people in society. Still, I hope that if you are into tech writing, then you can use the framework from this talk as a bit of a toolkit that can help you feel somewhat better equipped to, on a case-by-case basis, consider what to look out for, what dimensions to consider, and what questions to ask when making ethical decisions around using generative AI professionally in your work. So yeah, if there's anything that you'd like to ask or chat about, I'd love to. So feel free to throw it into the Q&A or hit me up online. I'm Onrust at InfoSec Exchange on Mastodon, or Meyns at ProtonMail for email, or chrismeyns.xyz.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Chris is going to answer some of your questions. So we had so many questions and such good ones. But, you know, what I'm going to say is, even though I think we have a pretty long Q&A time slot, Chris, you should tell people if you're going to be hanging out in hallway 1 or 2, or if you're going to do an unconference, or if you just want people to contact you a different way.
Yeah. I mean, I hadn't thought about it, but if there's stuff not addressed at the end, then we can definitely take it elsewhere.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's start with the first question. By the way, like I was saying, but not everybody was here. People loved your talk. They loved your backgrounds. Such great content and so well produced. But let me go on to the first question.
Yes.
If a product organization decides to use automated AI that's likely to introduce falsehood into the docs, should we stand at that point and refuse the tools on ethical grounds?
Yeah, I think that will be a situation that many of us might be faced with at some point, because there's so much hype around these AI tools, and many organizations feel that they need to use them somehow to stay on top. So I think it depends on like your situation and whether it's really an imposition or more like a suggestion to use such a tool. But if you are aware that such a tool can introduce falsehoods, then one thing you could do, if you think that it could be beneficial to use it to get you more productive or to help you produce documentation more quickly or for other reasons, you could use some of these mitigation strategies that I also brought up in the talk, so that you let it generate a draft, but then treat it as a draft and then make sure that you run it through and check, hey, is this actually accurate? Does it accurately reflect the product that we're presenting? If you think that there's no space for that to run such a check, then one thing you could do, if that's an option in your situation, is state the case for why you think that this might actually harm users. And if you can bring that maybe backed up with some stats or other information, like if you can make that case to the person proposing to introduce it, then they might change their mind. So yeah, but it will depend on the actual situation that you're in. You don't have to outright refuse if you don't think that's helpful. But yeah, work with that.
Yeah, no, I think that's important that there's that they build time into your schedule to check.
Yeah.
Check the output.
Exactly.
Well, here's another great question. Now, do you think users interact sensibly with warnings about the quality of outputs? Or do you think they just click through? You know how people do. They just click, okay. Do you think they're actually going to read it?
So to answer it like confidently, I would have to check some like user testing that has been done on this. But from experience, watching people engage with things, it's, oh, pop up, click away. Or, oh, there was some info that stood in the way of me and the actual, like generating these actual fancy text or images. Let me ignore it for later. So I think it is important to put it in there, because otherwise you're providing people no information at all. So then you're completely leaving them in the dark. But I do think it is a practical reality that many people will skip over it and will then not take that in. Or even if they read it, there can be this sense of urgency of, well, I really want this now and I really need this generated, that will still make them decide to go with it anyway. But yeah, super good point to be alert about.
Absolutely. Because users just click through a lot of times. We see that in usability testing. And perhaps there are better ways to bring it to their attention than a pop-up. Well, it'd be something you'd have to think about. Yeah. Another thing that people were very interested in, a lot of people really reacted to your comment about how much energy it takes. And one of the things that's interesting about that is, I mean, if you don't know the answer to this, it's fine. But how does the energy required to build AI tools compare to the energy required for other computing tasks? It's kind of a big question. So if you don't know it, we would understand.
So that I am actually going to hold off on answering, because I don't have like at hand any stats for that. But I think what stood out for me when researching this was that it was, even if you look at it by itself, that it was such a significant amount of energy. And I think like even if there are other industries that use more energy, given that this or training these models costs such a lot of energy, I think it's still worth like being mindful of that and then making your choices about whether you want to use it based on that information. I mean, follow-up task for me to figure out the comparative energy uses of the different sectors.
Yeah, it's a big question, but I find myself saying, I'd really like to know the answer to that.
Yeah, definitely.
But it would probably require a lot of research to get it just right.
Yeah.
Well, here, as documentarians, we might document how to use these tools and even financially benefit from them. But how accountable do you think we are as makers for harmful outcomes by the people who are using the tools?
Yeah, I think that's it's definitely a really crucial question. And that's also what Helen Nissenbaum discusses in the papers that I mentioned in the talk and also linked in the chat, that as soon as you're using, so they're initially talking about computers generally, but now also with these AI systems, it's not built by just one person. There's so many people involved. And then there's a tendency for responsibility and accountability to become really diffuse. So even if you're aware that there's a harmful system, then as a tech writer, you think, well, I didn't build it. I'm just documenting how it works, and then other people can decide whether they use it. But the developers might think, well, I didn't come up with it. I'm just building what was needed here.
Right.
In the end, yeah, you're.
Go on. I'm sorry.
Oh no, I mean it's actually something best talked about in dialogue, I suppose. But yeah, in the end, all of the parties are contributing to bringing this into the world as a successful product. Also, if you're like sharing it on social media, talking about it, you're giving it more visibility. Yeah, so there is some sort of involvement and accountability there, responsibility there. But you can also flip that around. Like if you are aware that there are potential harms, you can also, if you're good at writing or good at doing videos or giving talks, you can also use that as an opportunity to bring that out into the world. So to make people alert about the risks.
Yeah, that's a good point. If you can use your presence to tell people about the risks as well as the rewards.
Definitely, yeah.
Very well said. Well, we've been wondering if purposely keeping the training data set small and hyper internal to avoid, ethical concerns with training on data sets that maybe belong to someone else, can that negatively impact the value of the AI tool to end users? Is that kind of the other end of that concern? This is, by the way, before you get started, this is our last question. Yeah. Okay. So
I recently came across a paper on exactly this point about do these training data sets need to be super huge in order to be effective and to perform well? And there, what they came up with, like testing based on a couple of metrics, was actually it doesn't really make that much of a difference beyond a certain point. I will go into my reference manager to find the reference for that, and then I'll post it in the chat as well, because this was just one paper that I came across. But if that's correct, what these researchers found, then actually keeping a small focused data set might actually not be very damaging at all. It could actually be just as helpful. But I'll find a paper and then people can judge for themselves.